Hi, I'm Josh Bassages, Director and CEO of the Royal Ontario Museum. Welcome to this special online presentation of our signature lecture series, ROM Speaks. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation since time immemorial to today. From fascinating viewpoints to thought-provoking insights, ROM Speaks presents the brightest minds and most compelling voices on ideas that matter across art, culture, and nature. Please enjoy this essential new addition to our ROM at Home digital programming. And I look forward to welcoming you back to the museum for more programs like this when it is safe to do so.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for coming tonight. This is a really, really amazing crowd. So, if we start with the sort of geographical location of Faviken, which is really important for the way we work with our produce. I mean, it's located, I usually say it's located up north in Sweden, but it's actually just located halfway up through Sweden, you know, just on the Norwegian border. Oh, sorry. Yes, there. And Faviken is located on the 63rd parallel. So it's quite far north. Toronto is located on the 43rd parallel. And no one thinks of Toronto as south. But it's really south compared to Faviken. And if you look in Canada, I tried to find a city that was located on the 63rd parallel, and I didn't find one. But the sort of southern bit of Baffin Island is on the 63rd parallel. And what makes the difference, though, is that we have the Gulf Stream that comes in and hits Europe, and it turns north alongside Norway, and we are located, as you see, quite close to the coast. And on the border between Norway and Sweden, there is a mountain range called the Scandian mountain range. And because there is a couple of passes in this range, very conveniently located for us, we have a pretty good climate, considering how far north we were actually located. So south of Faviken is going to be colder than it is where Faviken is located, as well as north of Faviken. Another city that's located on the 43rd parallel, by the way, like Toronto, is Bilbao in Spain. That's south. Yeah. I made a little comparison also, just because I thought it was interesting, with the sort of some climate data, where we can see that our climate is actually quite similar to what you would have here. I mean, your summers are definitely warmer than ours, but the curve is quite similar. Our winters are on average a little bit colder than yours, but they're about the same length. And then because you have a more of an inland climate, whilst we have more of a coastal climate, even though we're on the wrong side of the mountain range to have a real coastal climate, your sort of winter extremes are perhaps a little bit colder than ours, but our average is colder because we're further north. And what we have, though, because of the fact that we're located so far north, is that we have a lot of light. We're not to the point where we have midnight sun, but almost. So when you start counting number of sun hours during the vegetation season, it's really, really hard to beat northern Scandinavia. And this thing with us having, as you see, about 18 degrees for almost 3 months on sort of average high temperature, in combination with all of this sunlight, it makes it pretty good growing climate, especially for vegetables. I mean, we can't have like stone fruits and things like that, but we can grow excellent kale. You get a long way with kale. And I think this is one of the things that's sort of a little bit of a misconception with Faviken, that it's a little bit remote, but that also depends on where you start out from, I always say. And it is a little bit sort of sparse in terms of what you can grow and how you can grow it, but it's not as crazy as people think. I mean, everything that you can grow here, except like the really heat-loving plants, we can also grow. We can't grow tomatoes outside, for example. We have to have a glass house. But that's sort of the line where we can see that most of the things that people would take for granted in a really ambitious restaurant, we can also have. And the fact is also that a long and bright vegetation period in combination with low temperatures produces slow-growing vegetables, and they tend to have much more flavor. I mean, it's like strawberries. Have you, one of the amazing things with my job is that I get to travel a lot and meet a lot of people. And if you ask anyone anywhere in the world where you find the best strawberries, they always say here, like where they live themselves. Not here in Toronto, perhaps, but I'm sure that you guys say that these strawberries here are also the best in the world. But the fact is that almost any fruiting plant produces a more tasty and flavorful product the further north you get, or the closer to the climate limit that that plant has. And this is not just sort of something you can perceive from flavor, but you can actually measure, for example, in strawberries, the phenolic content of the berry in relationship to the sugar maturity of the berry. But the further north you get, the more flavor in relationship to sugar you'll have. Anyhow, we can start with spring. Because for me, spring is sort of the start of the year, in the sense that it's the start of the growing season, which marks the start for our produce year. And for me, spring is, I mean, there is obviously meteorological definitions of spring, but for me, it's when the snow is gone. That's when spring starts. And in spring, I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of people here who garden, and many of you might know the term the hungry gap. But for those who might not know that, it's that time of the year, like in the old days when people lived more from their family farm and so on, it was the time of the year when you were kind of running out of stored things in spring, but when nothing has started to grow that you could harvest yet. And it sort of stretches surprisingly late into spring, because you can see here that there's nothing to harvest, but later in spring as well, when it's more green, it's still not that much that you kind of want to eat of what grows yet. So we do a lot of stored things still at this time of year. Let's say this is in April. And it's a lot about planning the menu for the rest of the year. Because for me, the creation of a dish, it doesn't start with the finished product that's going to become the dish. So we don't buy a carrot in October if you want to cook a carrot dish in October. We're going to buy the seed already before this in January and start planning for that specific variety of carrot that we want, that has the properties we need. And then we're going to plan for when it's going to be sown, how it's going to be sown, how it's going to be grown, and finally when it's going to be harvested and how it's going to be stored, and then what part of the dish is going to play. And to me, this is, I mean, it's one of the most fantastic privileges of running a restaurant like Faviken, is to be able to have this level of control of the products. Because for most chefs, reality is that, I mean, you want the carrot in October, you call the guy with the carrots, or the greengrocer, and you get the carrot. And if you're happy with it, you'll continue. If you're unhappy, you'll return it, and you'll get another carrot. But that's sort of the level of control that you can hope for. So a lot of seeds, a lot of planning, and then it's really about preparing. I mean, you know what those things are? The spindly-looking ones? That's asparagus roots, asparagus crowns. Just went into the ground. And I mean, a bit later in spring, when things are, I mean, those crowns don't produce asparagus like that after 1 year. It takes many years. But a bit later in spring, when the hungry gap is ending, it's kind of when the asparagus starts coming, and all of these plants that have stored energy in the roots start sprouting. And that's sort of really, for us, it's sort of mid-May, end of May. But that's when we can start doing things that people associate with spring. And up north is almost summer then. And you can see, like in restaurants, at least in Sweden, I can imagine it's sort of the same here. You can see restaurants, they're starting with like their asparagus when it's still snow outside, and it comes from I don't know where. But you know, it can never be as good as the asparagus that you've grown yourself and that you harvested just before you cooked it. And there's another dimension that makes this asparagus that we do a lot better as well. And it's the fact that we wait for it. We look forward to it. We don't give in and start serving it already in February, you know? Yeah, and all of these sort of photos here, these are mostly photos that I took with my phone in the kitchen, so they're not sort of fit for publication or anything like that, but it kind of gives you an idea. It's also like end of spring is also the time of putting seedlings in the ground, and towards the very end, we can also start harvesting a few small root vegetables. And that sort of, to me, it really signifies the start of summer. This photo here, it was taken very early in summer. This is early June, and this is taken on a mountain farm quite close to Fäviken. This is an amazing place. If you ever make it to Jämtland, where Fäviken is located, you'll email Fäviken and you'll ask for directions to go here. This is one of the very last of these mountain farms that used to be very common in all of northern Scandinavia, where people lived only in the summer. And what they did was that they they didn't want to harvest, or they didn't want the cows to eat the grass close to the main farm, because that meant that they had to transport hay in from further away, and this was pre-mechanization of agriculture. So what they did was that they had a second farm like this one on a useless piece of land somewhere far up in the mountains, and they sent their cattle there and their kids in the summer. And then all of the adults stayed at the main farm, and they produced grains and made hay and things like that. And then the kids came back with the cows in fall, and they brought with them butter and cheese and brown cheese and things like that. That was sort of a byline. That was not really about this talk, but it's very interesting, I think. It's a beautiful place. The start of summer for us, it's really about wild vegetables and foraging of wild vegetables. And it's one of these things that's sort of become a bit emblematic for the style of cooking that I do at Fäviken and all of these sort of ambitious restaurants that happen right now in the Nordic region. Everyone thinks that we have foraged leaves and things on everything all the time. But the fact is that most of them are really only good in the beginning of the season, because they're so bitter and strong and tough and terrible later. So it's really something that we do in June. This is, for example, the first dandelion leaves. They haven't really even started to photosynthesize completely, so they're still a little bit yellow. They're amazing. This is what a dish could look like on the past then. This is a little lamb's tongue with dandelion leaves. The gardens start to grow, and they're not yet sort of early. It's a bit early still in June to start harvesting. This is my garden at my house. This is not at Fäviken. But you can see that it's sort of turning into summer, and you can see the promise of produce that's going to come very soon. And in the summer at Fäviken, we focus a lot about freshness. So it can be broad beans like this, for example. It can be peas, and rather than what we do in the winter, where it's all about preserving them in the best possible way, here it's about serving them as fresh as possible. So we will, for example, go out to the gardens during service and pick peas and just pop them into a little bowl and straight onto the plate before any of the sugars have deteriorated at all. So you can get them at their very, very sweetest. And to me, that sort of high summer is all about that. It's about cooking things pretty much as little as possible and just bring them to the guest, you know. And that's also something that's amazing with running a restaurant in the countryside. You can never do that in a city. Even if you have the best pea grower there's no way that he can get them there as quickly as we can when we just go out and pick it ourselves and go back into the kitchen and serve them. And it's also the time of the year when the crops that you can store are beginning to mature, like end of July, early August, something like that. For fish, trout. To me, this is also high summer, before the trout start spawning, and when they've had a couple of months of eating a lot of bugs. They're at their fattiest this time of year. We always serve trout in the summer. Imagine that. Fat, wild trout and peas just popped straight from the pod. That's amazing. It's also a time of the year when you can see a lot of the animals have a lot of food to eat. You can see because they lay on a lot of fat. This, for example, is mutton. It's something that we typically serve towards end of summer. And for example, in this case, I mean, you see it has a lot of fat and it's quite a big piece. This was a ewe that didn't have any lambs that year, so she basically has grazed all through summer and fattened up almost like, it looks almost like a little piece of beef. You know. If we move on into autumn, it's sort of when everything needs to happen. I mean, August and September and a little bit into October is when all of that produce needs to, you know, arrive at Faviken, when it needs to be processed in the restaurant and in the prep kitchen, and finally stored. And for us, it really starts with berries. We serve a lot of berries in different dishes. I mean, we really try to make the menu about berries and later mushrooms in fall, but we also collect an enormous amount of berries for winter storage. I mean, we make jams for breakfast, it's all of the juices for the non-alcoholic pairing. It's all of the planning for dishes that needs berries as condiments during winter, sweet and savory. And it's also all of the juices, the bottled juices for our little cafe in the ski town close to Faviken. So we usually buy, I mean, anywhere between 5 and 7 tons of wild berries every fall. And this, once again, as I said before, I mean, the further north you go, the more phenolics, which means more flavors, you will have at the point where the berry reaches sugar maturity, which means that it will stop developing and fall off. If you have a warmer climate, more water and warmer climate, like in Southern Europe, for example, it'll grow faster. And when it reaches sugar maturity, after maybe 3 weeks instead of 10 weeks like up north, you know, it falls off. And I mean, the strawberry can be this big. And then with us, it's like that big. But it can contain equal amounts of phenolics. It's just that ours are, you know, squeezed into that tiny little piece of strawberry. Yeah, the few tree fruits that we have, they also start yielding in the end of summer, early autumn, like plums, for example. And this is one thing we did with them this year, where we, you can see they look a bit dusty, but they're actually frosty, because we wanted to make prunes. I love prunes. It's a really, really lovely way of storing fruit, but there's also a problem with them, and it's that they oxidize a lot, and they taste like prunes, which is delicious, but also a little bit hard to work with if you want to have, you know, a bit more of a delicate flavor, perhaps, but still retain the texture of the prune. And one way of doing that would be to use sulfur, like you would industrially, like, for example, if you dry apricots and they're orange, they're treated with sulfur so they don't oxidize, and we don't really like that. So what we did instead was that we took the plums and we froze them, and we put them in the dehydration room overnight, frozen, and let them defrost while dehydrating. And then in the morning, when they were just defrosted, we put them in the freezer again, and we just repeated this process. And this is when they had just been taken out of the freezer in the morning, and we're going into the dehydration room sort of halfway through the process. And what we obtained then was like the texture and sort of possibility to store the plum as a prune, but still retaining the fresh flavor of the prune, because it wasn't allowed to oxidize and become brown, essentially. Fall is also time for honey harvest. I have bees at home, and I harvest honey there for Faviken, usually a couple of 100 kilos every year. Mushrooms. I mean, we try to, like with the berries, serve as much as we possibly can at Faviken on the menu, fresh in fall, like with girolles, for example. But we also harvest a lot of and buy a lot of mushrooms that we want to store for winter. Those ones on the other side, they're pine mushrooms, and what we typically do with those, if we at least if we get so much in that we can't use all of them fresh, is that we put them in sunflower seed oil in glass jars, and we pasteurize them, we can them. And this is a really good example of one of those things that we prepare in fall that then becomes a dish in winter. And this winter we served with perch. And I mean, they store for years if you do that properly. And you can just open the can up and, you know, cut it into halves and fry it nicely or grill it or do something like that with it. And then obviously game. I've understood by talking to a lot of Canadian chefs and other people here that it's a bit difficult to serve game in restaurants here. In Sweden, it's also a little bit difficult, but at least it's possible. So we do that a lot. Here with grouse, for example. Here, this is in the sort of receiving kitchen at Faviken, receiving prep kitchen at Faviken, and in the walk-in butchery fridge. This is wild duck that's being prepped. And basically from the third weekend of August until end of October, all of the meat that we serve at Faviken will be game meat, wild meat. That continues a little bit into winter as well. Especially on the moose side, we can get really good moose all the way into winter. Not so much gardening though. And in winter, the focus shifts completely and the style of the menu changes a lot. It will be about more protein, more, you know, especially from the sea, because we're very close, as I said before, to the coastline of Norway, so we have access to amazing seafood, and that's really at its best from, let's say, November and onwards. So a lot of that. And then a lot of things that have been stored some way, and almost nothing in terms of vegetables or non-protein products that are actually fresh. This is the first time I ever grew Chikons from endive. I've gotten a lot better since that one. Chikons is one of those. It's like the king of winter vegetables, and it's one of the most misunderstood winter vegetables there is. No one really knows how it works and how it's produced, or it's just that annoyingly bitter little head of salad that most people don't really like. But Chikons they could be a root vegetable. They're biennials. You sow the seed and it grows during summer. It produces sort of a leafy little bush, about this size, and it produces a taproot that looks sort of like a parsnip, a little bit shorter, but it's white and a little bit fat. And when the plant dies back in September, October, after a couple of frosts, you harvest the taproot and you leave it out to dry for a little bit, and then you cool it, and you cool it to 2 degrees for at least 2 weeks, preferably a little bit longer. And this is called vernalization. And it's basically tricking the plant into believing that winter has come and gone and that it's time to start growing again. And the last step of this is that you take the refrigerated taproot and you put it in some kind of growing medium, like peat or soil or wood chips or whatever you have, and you put it somewhere completely dark and a little bit warm. It doesn't have to be very warm, but as long as it's warmer than where you had it refrigerated, it will believe, this plant, that it's time to start growing to make that flower. And why it's important to keep it in complete darkness is because you want to have that torpedo shape that the chikon has, right? And the reason for it getting that, rather than like being all bushy and leafy and everything, is because it still thinks it's underground. I mean, the shape of the chikon is perfectly made to pierce the ground when it's growing towards the surface. And what happens mostly in industry, and this I learned just a couple of years ago when I grew some myself, and I tasted a leaf down in the basement of my house, and I was completely amazed by the sweetness of these vegetables. Because to me, endive or chikon is always about something being very bitter. And I just realized that it's just about process. Because the industry that grows chikons are really good at eliminating any UV light during the growing process. But then after that, they just sort of let go of the control. And the retail side, they're really bad at eliminating UV light. Because what happens with just a couple of minutes of sunlight, or even like the light from fluorescent lighting tubes, it triggers a reaction in the Chikon because it thinks that it's broken through the ground and that it's time to, stop being torpedo-shaped and going into a bush with a flower again. And what happens then is that it sort of starts to photosynthesize, and in order to do that, it needs to produce chlorophyll, and to do that, it uses up the sugars in the leaves. And the chlorophyll is also bitter. So just a couple of minutes of sunlight makes the Chikon much more bitter, and it reduces the amount of sweetness in the plant. And it turns into that little annoyingly bitter head of salad. And to me, that was sort of a revolution when I saw that, and we got really into growing Chikons, and we've developed a very intricate system in how it's done. I don't grow them myself anymore. It's one of our farmers who does it for us. And they're like, when we put them on the grill, which is how we cook them currently, they've never been exposed to any UV light. Like, all of the handling of them is done with red lights, like that, like in a photographic darkroom. And it really makes a difference. I mean, it makes a huge difference when you bite into it. Winter is also about things that were stored from summer, like beans, for example, that we harvest huge quantities of. This is a picture of the root cellar on a snowy day. And at Faviken, there are two root cellars. One, that's the original cellar that was located about 400 meters away from the restaurant. Very inconvenient when the weather is like that. So after about 1 year, we built a new one that was a bit closer, and it's this one. Cheese is also one of those things that we only really serve in winter. We only work with in winter. And it's also, even though people don't think about it today, I mean, the idea of cheese is to prolong the shelf life of milk and to get rid of a lot of that unnecessary water that milk is made up of. And cheese, for example, for us, if you look at that mountain farm that I told you guys about before, I mean, it was the main production there. And cheese, you get rid of about 90% of the water weight of the original weight of the milk. So it's easy transportable, it has long shelf life, it's tasty, everything is good with cheese. As I said, it's also a lot of Norwegian fish and seafood that time of year. Yeah, this is an amazing product that we only have for a little bit in winter. This is frost. And I mean, I'm sure that a lot of people in a northern climate like this, when they were kids, maybe you ate a little bit of frost from a twig or something like that. And it is kind of amazing. I mean, the taste is so pure, and there is a very special texture to frost as well. And I mean, we have for a couple of weeks in early winter, when the ice hasn't formed on the lakes yet, so it's a bit humid. And if we're lucky then, and it's cold, we get amazing frosts on all of the trees and branches. It can be like this thick with frost on a tiny, tiny little twig. And you can almost see it looks almost like little flowers. And this we harvest, and we use it for desserts. This year we served it with just whipped cream, and then lots of this frost and sprinklings of beet sugar that we made. I think I said that before as well. And our beet sugar, it really tastes of beets. It's really delicious. So that's a very rare product that you only get for a couple of weeks in winter. And then when it comes to protein, to me, winter is about freshwater fish, like late winter when the sun is coming back and when people start ice fishing. And we do, for example, a lot of perch in late winter before they go spawning in spring. This is another example of a product that we force, just like the endive. Rhubarb. And what we do is that we grow rhubarbs, like the big plant. We don't harvest them in summer. Oh, my time is up. Stop. Yeah. We grow them in summer and we don't harvest them at all. We just let them photosynthesize. And then in fall, when the plant has died, we grow the whole root up. And it's like a big lump like this. It's a really massive, woody piece of root. And then we store it. And I mean, I don't know exactly how this happens, because you can store it in exactly the same space. It has the same temperature. It has the same light conditions and everything. But towards end of winter, they start growing again. And you get glass rhubarb, the very pale pink, straight, long rhubarbs. And that sort of, to me, is sort of what signals that winter is coming to an end and it's time to start with spring again. And that was almost on time.
Thank you, Magnus. Now now I know why everything's so good at your restaurant. At home, it was all out of cans, as I recall. We're now going to expand the conversation to include Jamie Kennedy and Jacob Richler, who will now join us on stage.
I never realized I'd been so wasteful with frost.
Most people haven't.
Thanks so much, Magnus. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
Jamie, it's great to be here with you at the ROM again. I have lovely memories of you here. Usually I'm holding a knife and fork, but...
I'm feeling nostalgic.
So as you began with our comparable temperatures, there's a lot in common between our countries, and in our food as well.
Yeah.
And something struck me reading an interview you did when your book on Nordic cuisine came out. You talked about how little known Nordic cuisine was until very recently, and you said most people abroad only knew. Excuse me, cliches really, like gravlax and herring.
Yeah, either that or, about Faviken and Noma.
Right.
And neither that nor the gravlax is very indicative of what people actually eat.
For us, again, very similar. People know tortilla, and if you've frightened people with fermented shark, we've done the same with poutine. But
I think that's quite tasty, though, isn't it?
The shark or the poutine?
Both.
But both of you started your careers at a time when all that was changing.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to that because there's something in your personal journey that I find interesting for its similarities, for the similarity. You went to France. You cooked for 3 years at L'Astrance, and when you came home, you gave up cooking because you were so appalled by the quality of ingredients at home, and chose to do something about it. And you had a similar experience but different. So I'll go to both of you in turn to ask about that.
Yeah. For me, it was part of it was that the quality of produce in Stockholm then, this is 12 years ago, it was just so much less good than what I was used to working with in Paris, like you said. But it was also another thing for me, and it was that everything I did felt like it was someone else's food. It felt like the food of the restaurant where I used to work, La France, which is natural. Today I don't think is very a big deal, but it felt like that then. And it felt like someone else's food, but with less good stuff in it, which was not, it was just not pleasurable at all.
And what about you, Jamie, when you came back from your time?
Sure. Well, things started here, actually, in Toronto with my apprenticeship at, some of you may know, the Windsor Arms Hotel here in Toronto. And at that time, of course, we didn't really have an identity in food. Restaurants were not the culture of restaurants that they are today. So we imported a lot of talent from Europe, and it was not uncommon for any hotel in Toronto at that time to have a Swiss chef at the helm and Swiss German being spoken in the kitchen. And that was certainly my experience as an apprentice in the mid-70s. I think, Jacob, what happened with me here at the end of my apprenticeship, of course, we're learning, we're just learning, we're getting our chops in cooking, and we're not really asking a lot of questions, we're just doing what we're told. I think the awakening happens when if you are a thinking cook, you start to question later, not at that stage. So I think during my apprenticeship, I had memories, taste memories, of areas that really remind me of Jämtland?
Jämtland, yeah, that was
not
good.
Bad, eh?
Pretty good.
Not bad. Up in northern Ontario on lakes, and my aunt had a cottage up there, and wild blueberries are a taste memory that I have as a 7-year-old, and nothing that we were preparing in the restaurant or the hotel at the Windsor Arms had anywhere near the organoleptic properties, or what's the compound in the fruit where it's grown north?
The phenolics?
The phenolics. So I could relate to that taste experience, and the question remained in my head, well, how come this is supposed to be such a great hotel restaurant in the center of Toronto? How come things just don't taste all that great? Anyway, fast forward, another 15 years in, and thinking about food more, and the origin of food, and coming from a no tradition really in my family of gastronomy, nothing to be proud of. Like my Italian friends all spoke of dishes that their grandmothers made. I didn't really have a lot of that, except for preserving food. My earliest inspirations came from my great aunt, who lived in Toronto, and took me down into her basement and showed me shelves of preserved fruits and vegetables and recipes that she had used that dated back to the 19th century in southern Ontario. Again, the culture really was much more alive before, of course, things became much more mechanized and industrial. It seemed like food culture was much more alive when we were truly responding to the seasons and what we were given here, climate-wise, in southern Ontario. Anyway,
but I wanted to get a bit at wild ingredients and what you forged culinary identity on. In your case, relatively extreme mosses like in game and so forth. We've never been all that keen to eat that kind of thing in our restaurants, but nonetheless.
But maybe, this is also a thing, because yes, because I've done that now, and a few other restaurants have done it, doesn't mean that it's something that's common in the Nordics today. And maybe if you look back here, it would surprise me a lot if lichens, for example, were not utilized, or like birch tree phloem, for example, birch tree bark, and things like that. I'm sure they were, because that knowledge was part of like Northern European cooking, and those guys also came here, and I'm sure that they brought with them. So maybe if you look at historical sources, there was actually people who made lichen flour, for example, and things like that. But maybe that just needs to be done.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I agree. I think there were
it's not that
things
tasty,
happening in rural areas, a culture developing that was never really talked about. It just stayed inside the family.
But the wild foods we put on the table here are unfortunately not exclusive to us, like ramps in the spring or morels or whatnot. Did you ever feel your hands were tied a bit by not being able to go a little further and put game on the plate?
Certainly. We talked about a little bit about this earlier, how it's more difficult, more challenging for cooks, restaurateurs to put wild game on menus here, and how it's a shame, really. There are good reasons why our food safety systems are in place. They do, however, dampen our evolution of food culture.
Just when I flip through your cookbook, I see in a lot of ways, what could be us or should be us, it seems to me. But I was surprised to learn from you that it's actually a little bit complicated to serve wild game in Sweden as well. Not as bad as here, but
it is, and this is once again about sort of the misunderstanding of what Nordic food culture is, because naturally people base their image of what Nordic food culture might be on the information that's there, which is like, for example, the Faviken book and so on. And the fact is that 10 years ago, or a little bit further back before Noma and Faviken, to see game on the menu of an ambitious restaurant in season was very rare. Really rare. Because it is complicated, and there's lots of permits, and there's a lot of regulations and things like that. When I kind of started to want to do that, people eat a lot of game in their homes. But everyone was like, no, that's forbidden. Then I was like, well, in which way is it forbidden? And you start looking at it, and it turns out that it was not, because the European Food Act that also governs the way our food health and safety system works in Sweden, it's very short, and basically it says that it puts all the responsibility on the restaurateur.
Right.
And if you can provide documentation and proof that whatever you're doing is safe, that's basically okay. But there was a lot of regulations in place, interpretations and IDs from various government bodies and various sort of people who has authority over these things that did not correspond with this at all. So I mean, we were told that we were not allowed. But then when we started sort of researching ourselves and started really going deep into this, we saw that there were ways to kind of work around this. And today, I mean, we, for example, the space that I told you about in the beginning, where we can process large amounts of food, so the arrival kitchen, it is licensed as a game butchery or abattoir or whatever you want to call it. Right. So we can have a veterinarian coming there and wanted to inspect, for example. You know.
Have you ever met a health inspector who would believe you if you said something, told him something was safe?
No, it's a different playing field here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like the idea of giving the responsibility to the restaurateur to ensure that the public is safe with the food that is being produced. I think something similar exists certainly in Germany. I've heard from my friend Michael Statlander that it's possible to buy wild game in season from hunters, because hunters are given a level of responsibility in society to ensure that the food that they're hunting is also safe and free of disease. And then they're able to sell it to restaurants with it passing along that same protection. And so then the restaurateur is in turn allowed to sell it to the public, and it seems to me a progressive way of thinking about and allowing food culture to evolve in a way that, you know, we are poised to do that here.
Yeah, it just seems
shackled.
It saddens me because it seems a squandered opportunity. That one of the restaurants that we have here, obviously, that's made such an international reputation for itself is Raymond's in Newfoundland, and that reputation is forged on wild foods that you can't serve here in Ontario, which is a shame.
Yeah, I'm wondering about that actually. So it's provincial law. I always thought it was federal.
There's three. The game is under it falls under the responsibility of provincial ministries. They forbid the sale for profit of wild meats. Then there are city health inspectors, and then there's the federal CFIA.
Right.
So you basically, every which way you turn, you're going to lose, except for grandfathered situations like Newfoundland or maybe the Northwest Territories, where as we discussed before, the game is not something you really want to buy. If you encounter a muskox, it'll be, you know, a griddle burger or something. So.
Yeah. Well, speaking of grandfathers and grandmothers, Magnus, I was really interested to ask you actually. I mean, I really admire your contribution to food culture and gastronomy in your country, and I'm wondering. I mean, I'm fascinated by your inspirations and your practice, and you've grown from a tiny little restaurant to a little bit bigger than tiny restaurant, and the number of staff is now 35, and you speak about quality of life, and to me that translates as keeping morale high. You're in a remote location. There's so many questions, but the one I really wanted to ask was, your grandparents or your antecedents, the people who came before you, is there a strong Nordic food culture that is a starting point for you in your creation?
Yes and no. Because so my grandmother on my mother's side, she was a cook. She worked in a nursing home, and I mean she cooked amazing sort of traditional Swedish food, and so did my other grandmother as well. And my grandparents on my father's side, they lived on a farm. So I saw, I mean, and they were kind of the very tail end of like the traditional European family farm, which sort of was geared half towards sales and half towards production for self-sustenance. But there was also a paradox there, because my grandmother on my dad's side, for example, on the farm, I mean, they made all of these sort of things. They preserved vegetables and meat, and they did the hunting. They had animals, they made cheese, but they kind of looked at that as something that was very unmodern and not wanted. So I mean, I distinctly remember, because she also baked amazing cookies and buns and things, but she always preferred herself to buy like factory-made muffins in a purple plastic bag from a company called Hegges. And I mean, she was really into those. And if it was like a special guest or a birthday, it was going to be those, not like the amazing homemade cake. And also, for example, I mean, she had a vegetable garden, and she always refused to grow peas, because you can buy frozen peas, and then you don't have to shell them. So much better. And I think that's sort of, it's very easy to forget today that, I mean, not that long ago, people had to be concerned about a whole other set of things when it came to their food, the fact that they didn't have enough food. And I mean, my grandparents, they grew up in a Sweden where people still starved. So for them, all of these advances and, you know, food becoming cheaper and more easily available, pre-processed, fully processed, whatever, for them it was just like, go innovation. Just throw all the old shit out and buy frozen peas. You know?
Well, I think you've answered my question. So
Yeah.
I noticed on your website that if for young cooks applying for jobs there, you won't talk to anyone at all if they don't have a driver's license.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I made that error a couple of times. It turns into problems.
Where do they go?
At home, then. No, and the thing is, I mean, Faviken, it is, most of the staff, they live in a ski town called Åre,
Okay.
which is about 25 minutes by car from Faviken, but there is no public transport. Faviken is not a village, it's just a farm on a big piece of land. So there is no way to get around. And even if you can sort of carpool with your colleagues and all that, living where we live without a driver's license, I mean, there's no freedom at all. I mean, you can't do anything. So that's why we don't employ people without a driver's license.
Caught my eye. The products we were talking about earlier, there was another one that fascinated me that we don't have here. Old dairy cows.
Yes. So, I mean, today we have beef cattle and dairy cows, and they're like completely different. I mean, they're different strains of different breeds, and they are kept entirely different. And the one, it stands there and it does nothing for 3 years except becoming a carcass in the end that you eat. And the other one, it makes milk for 10 years in a good scenario, and then it becomes dog food, you know, or burgers. And if you just look 50, 60, 70 years back, there was only one cow, and it made milk, and then it became meat. And to me, that the reason why I sort of started with this was because that, to me, it first felt like it made more sense. And the reason why it's not like that today is because financially, because of cheap diesel fuel, essentially, it's more profitable to do it the way we do it now. But it produces much higher environmental impact. It uses a lot more grains that could be used to feed people instead of cows, and it produces a less good quality of meat. Because the fact is that something that has lived for 18 months, like I think is the case here we discussed before, it hasn't accumulated as much flavor as something that has lived for 10 years. I mean, it just hasn't.
You've had some experience eating it. I'm surprised how fine the fiber is for an older cat, despite the greater depth of flavor. When you were raising cattle, what was your experience?
So I was actually working with a breed that was, we talked earlier about how at some point, you said it was World War II, after World War II, we started to identify dairy cattle in one stream and meat cattle in another stream. So I was working with a breed that was pre that, so it was a cow, and it was raised for meat, and it was also raised for dairy. But I was intrigued by the idea of growing cattle longer before slaughter, because for that very reason that there's more flavor. And you'd hear people say, this is how beef used to taste, So I imagine at a time earlier that we used to let cattle grow longer before we discovered industrially that it's a diminishing return the longer you let the cow stay alive. But the value system has shifted to something where flavor was important, to something where the commodity of raising beef cattle was important, the economic benefit of early slaughter. So I just wanted to push that and see for myself. So I let a cow grow for 4 years, and it was the most delicious comparison to beef that I've been using in the restaurant for years and I was accustomed to tasting. The problem was mad cow disease happened, and the CFIA reacted by creating this one-size-fits-all policy, which said that you can't slaughter a beef animal older than 30 months without leaving the spine at the abattoir where it was slaughtered. And so it doesn't make sense. It just started not to make sense. But as a personal project, as an experiment, I can tell you that older cattle taste better, for sure.
Something you'd like to serve.
Mm-hmm. Something I would like to serve.
Now, I can't see because of the lights. Are we okay for time up here?
We're almost done. One thing I wanted to ask before you say your final remarks, is your part of Sweden in darkness this time of year? Like, is it mainly pretty dark up there?
The sun is coming back. I mean, we're not part of the or north of the polar circle. We're just south of it. So, I mean, yeah, it's pretty dark. But it's pretty light in the summer. You have to remember that.
Yeah.
So, but now, I mean, you can really feel the light coming back. And I mean, I measure because I like to get my gardening going very early, and the seedlings and all that. So I measure the light in the greenhouse. I generally turn the heating on. I mean, I'm going to do it when I come home from here. And I measure every day with like a light measure from for a camera. And about mid-March, you have the same light levels as you have in Southern Europe. That's when they cross, and then after that we just get more and more. Wonderful. Until it gets less and less.
Thank you. So next time you're here, you'll be promoting a book on baking?
Yes, that's the next fall.
Next fall.
The Nordic baking book it will be. Basically, I did. So the story of the Nordic cookbook, I'm just because this is sort of funny. After it was 1 year late, I got an email from Emilia, who's my publisher, that said, "Dear Magnus, Merry Christmas. For me, it's not an option not to publish next fall, Emilia." And during that extra year, I had done a lot of research. So all of the material didn't fit in the first book. Mm-hmm. So I've done a little bit more research and a lot of new illustrations and stuff like that. And then now we made a dedicated baking book where we put all of the stuff that couldn't fit in the first book. So that's for next year.
Excellent. Thank you so much.